Welcome to Colourful, a podcast where we explore how race shapes our experiences. I'm Stacy Jane, a white woman and mom of two living in Cape Town, looking to challenge the systems of privilege.
And I'm Sena, a black woman living in Johannesburg, passionate about interrogating power dynamics and the intersection of identities. Our vision? To spark candid and open dialogues for a more inclusive South Africa.
We're not afraid to have uncomfortable conversations because we believe that complacency perpetuates injustice.
Ultimately, we aim to bridge divides through empathy and understanding. Sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, but at least we're doing it together. Welcome to Colourful. Okay, so we've explored quite a lot of ground in our previous episodes, diving deep into the nuances and complexities of race and privilege in our personal lives. But today we're getting back to basics.
Through our engagement with listeners and the feedback that we've received, we've realized that we need to address a fundamental issue, and that is systemic racism. Specifically, we need to clarify what we mean when we talk about racism. So essentially, we're actually discussing the definition of racism.
Now, you might be thinking, of course, everyone knows what racism is, but not quite. Stacy and I found that many people define racism in different ways. In fact, as we've been discussing our podcast and its objectives with people, we've encountered multiple and differing understandings of what racism actually means.
So we thought it was important to really highlight our position. We want to leave no room for doubt about the kind of racism that we speak about on this podcast.
Okay, since we're going to definitions can get quite philosophical and a little bit technical. So when we were discussing this episode, we knew that we had to reach out to someone who's a thought leader and who can articulate this important message. That's why today we are joined by a pan-Africanist, activist, and leader. Our guest is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa, an associate at a large global law firm, an Allen Gray Fellow, professional speaker, facilitator, and someone I love dearly and consider to be a lifelong friend. Welcome, Bwanika Lwanga.
Cool. Bwanika, do you want to start by telling us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yes. So I'm born to a father from a small village in Uganda called Kampala. I am born to a mother who is from a small township in the Eastern Cape called Mdantsane. And I am raised in a small town in the Eastern Cape called Ikomani, where I was born into a family that was somewhat middle class. And then towards the later years of our democracy, then, downwardly middle class. I'm socialized through Model C system of schooling, team sports and accolades. And, I then, after my teenage years, moved into a university system that orchestrated me very largely towards Black, pan-Africanist, intersectional way of being. And what is constituted to be my activism is largely inspired by love for my friends and everyone around me. And I now have the privilege of practicing law in an environment that really enables me to be curious in a way that's childlike and supports a lot of my ideas. Privileged to be able to do this, in the context of the largest law firm in the world, and still be able to harbor and retain a big part of what I believe should be the complexion and the structure of our society. So I'm just a lighty from Komani who has come and made a way, as a migrant worker in Johannesburg, and I get to live my dream and meet cool people like you, right?
Yeah, friend, I just must say that, you mentioned that the basis of everything you do is love. It's the basis of everything that I feel like you embody even in your activism. So this is a special episode for me because of that. Like, I'm just happy to have you here.
No, you and I have come a long way. I mean, we've been friends since we were kids, and to
I
traverse,
know.
this profession and to constantly face challenges. We have such a common story, and so I do love you in a way that really, really, inspires me towards action and mobilizes me towards just respecting the soft landing that you provided. So it's a natural consequence of coming across someone like you. It's not really about me as well.
Like, look at this. Oh, stop. Okay. As you said, we were kids when we met, but when I was introduced to you back then, you introduced yourself to me as Lawrence. So now you go by Bwanika. Can you tell our listeners why you prefer to be called Bwanika?
So it's not even a matter of preference, Sena. It's a matter of sense. I'm a Black guy in Africa, and if names have a meaning, and are a representation of place, space, and aspiration, I couldn't see why then, as a person who lives the kind of life that I live, that Lawrence would be reflective of what I was embodying and hoping to see. Bwanika is a beautiful name that was given to me by my family, which means the collection of something, right? And they had brought it within the context of wisdom, right? So ultimately, it means with the passage of time, inevitably will collect wisdom, and that's something I can resonate with. I think that's why I then eventually, in developing a sense of self-awareness, was able to say, well, Bwanika actually represents what I would like to spend my time on earth here doing. And it made sense. It wasn't even a preference thing.
And it makes perfect sense, as you say. And we are really excited to have you here, Bwanika. And Sena and I are steadfast in our belief that this platform is not just about educating white people. And when people see the title of this episode, which is What is Racism?, they could shrug it off as saying, well, isn't it quite obvious? It's not, because up until 2020, Merriam-Webster had defined racism as discrimination and prejudice against people based on their race or ethnicity. Now, my gut feel is that if you ask the majority of white people in this country whether they agree with that statement, they probably would and say, yes, that is the definition of racism. But it's missing the very foundation of racism, the part that gives it that eternal longevity, the reason why opportunities remain unequal 30 years after legal declaration of equity. And that is about who holds the power. So, Bwanika, can you help us unpack the structural, systemic, and power dynamics that facilitate racism and enable it to just keep on keeping on?
Sure. So, I mean, look, we can understand structural racism or systemic racism as the way in which the world is geared for the sole benefit of white people, right? By this, I mean, if we think of, the value of a certain racial group's death in relation to the other, if we think of a domestic worker, there's an image that comes to your mind. If you think of a car guard, there's an image that comes to your mind. If you think of the head of a banking division, there's a certain idea you try and rebel against and say, no, it can be a certain person, There is this innate social order that exists that we then have to give cognizance to. And all of these things seem to form a part of the social order, which we do sometimes question and we don't sometimes question. But I think ultimately, to crisply define what you're looking at, I think it's the way in which all organizations quite intentionally organize their time, their talent, and their resources in a way that extends or perpetuates the ill-gotten gains within a South African context of 1652, and kind of also unofficially exist in order to systemically set our social order. But it's global order in a manner in that fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you've articulated that kind of structure so succinctly. So I want us to zero in, because I think that when we look at just like the parasocial relationships that Black people and white people have with people of color, you can be tempted to think racism is hurt feelings, or like if your neighbor doesn't like you, so it's about changing how your white neighbor may view people and then treating them better. But those individuals, them treating people better or having more positive feelings towards people of color doesn't really make a difference for me. Why do we look at those individual kind of emotions and then assume that being anti-racist means changing how those people feel? What is the impact of that? Like why is it much broader than that?
I'd like to refer particularly to why that can't be the discussion. And there's an interesting quote that I eventually just thought captures all of it. So I'm not looking away. I'm just trying to read what it says, right? So Professor Joe Mudiri says that racism or institutionalized racism is the formation, the consolidation of transnational, transcontinental, and systemized world order that facilitates Western racial rule. It's a political system functioning as a specific mode of domination and subjugation of a certain group. So it has its own autonomous and semi-autonomous mechanisms. And I think this is incredibly important because it then goes to show us that what we are faced against, it's not necessarily just an interpersonal relationship, but it's a manner in which the whole social order is orchestrated. And so when we are addressing it, we can't necessarily start at the point of, oh, you've hurt my feelings, or oh, my feeling. That's not the point of departure. The point of departure is a globalized perspective to say, what is it about the world that gives a person the confidence to be the way they are and feel entitled to a certain way of treatment? I think the question must be broader. And for us to narrow it down to hurt feelings, I mean, it kind of sucks that an entire people was subjugated and put in a certain amount of land, and their wealth and resources continue to be pillaged to that day. That's also not a very great feeling, you know? So I think we have to have a bit more of a broader discussion about this issue. And that's why I was incredibly glad when you said we must have a globalized perspective to it instead of just an interpersonal.
Yeah, there was two things. So there was one, Sena, do you remember that conversation we had recently, was about 2 weeks ago with someone, and he termed it nice racist. Nice racist. So you don't realize that you're being racist because you're being so nice and you feel guilty. So therefore you're a nice racist, but you don't realize that you're perpetuating a system by not engaging with it, by not actually understanding the systemic nature of it and thinking that it's all about interpersonal relationships, which it really isn't. And so I hear a lot of conversations. We've started referring to them as conversations around the braai, Sena and I, because she often says to me, "Oh, what conversations did you have around the braai this weekend?" And we kind of unpack them. I've heard many justifications for racism by people who don't even realize that they are racist. And most recently, I got the question, okay, but surely you don't agree with reverse racism. And I had to pause for a moment because I felt so many feelings in that moment. And there's so much that I want to say and did say. But I'd love to hear from you why you think that comment was fundamentally flawed in the first place. Like why can reverse racism not even exist?
Yeah, and I think your conclusion is exactly where I was going to start. Right. So reverse racism does not exist, right? It cannot exist. It's an oversimplification of racial tension within the country, one. But two, it goes to ask a different kind of question, right? Which is, can black people be racist? That is the question that we're trying to ask. And the answer to that is no, especially in a South African context. There is no mechanism in the country by law or by social order that allows for black people to do to white people what white people were sanctioned through the courts and through the law to do to black people. There is no system that allows for black people to orchestrate something like the Sharpeville massacre, like the Duncan Village massacre. Those things are practically systemically impossible in this country. South Africa is like England, is like the Netherlands. There is a global order that speaks to the power that white people have to oppress black people. And that doesn't exist in any other context. So you cannot deploy the same kind of, weighting to this. It's just racial tension. And it's quite fair, really, because we have this social contract that's really imperfect, even though it's miraculous, right? The democratic order is a miracle. And sometimes the imperfect vehicle causes for these flashpoints.
And I think the last thing I also just want to touch on is the fact that we're talking about two types of systems here. There's the official system, the legal system, which you've referenced, and then there's the unofficial one, which is the system that was created by white people since the time of colonialism. And that will continue to exist because it was created by white people, and that is what gives unofficial power, even if your legal state doesn't give that same unofficial power. And I think that is the crux of why reverse racism is just not a thing.
So we spoke about now the very structural element and the systemic element. Now I want to touch on the psychological element of systemic racism. Now, various African thought leaders have dedicated their lives to highlighting this. I mean, the Fanan Sobukwe's and Koundas. Biko says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I want us to look at that a little bit more. Can you unpack the significance of what Biko was saying and how this plays out in current racial dynamics in South Africa?
I'm not a trained psychologist, but I mean, I also do have a lived experience as somebody whose body attracts that level of violence, right? And even though that doesn't necessarily qualify me to make a diagnosis of sort, it does allow me to make an observation. So I'm just putting the clear parameters of the perspective that I'm coming from. I do think, quite simply that, yes, racism is a waste of time. Like, can't I just get on with my life? There's this deep sense of frustration that I can't just get on with it because every single corner or every single time I have to come out of my body and consider somebody else's consideration. I think the most beautiful evolution of human experience can be had when we eventually get to transcend, these kind of demarcations. And I think Sobukwe speaks about it, about bringing a human face to the world in general. But I also do think like racism is a waste of time for white people outside of the material accumulation as well. It stops them from really being able to have a human experience, right? And it's the worst thing you can do to a population, right? To understand that humans are in this time and space only once. And like what you do with that is so important. And so anyone who exercises harm, I think, is really, really misusing their time, right? So when Biko speaks then about the potency of the weapon, right, which is the mind of the oppressed person, Biko is speaking to this idea that all of these structures, violence, the concentration camps that we refer to as townships, the fact of hierarchy, gender, patriarchy, those things are all geared towards entering or domineering not necessarily the physical body of the oppressed person in question, but the mind, because eventually you want to have a structure where the psychological domination is so far reaching that oppression is automatic, right? And I think you see this a lot. I had an interesting conversation with Senamila as well when I was about to move stables where I was practicing, where I was trying to figure out my career. I said, you find quite often that material accumulation within the context of Black people comes at the cost of the emptying of the essence of Blackness. And that's the cost, right? So ultimately, the domination that happens at a psychological level is the end goal. Either you are a subservient slave-like person with the golden handcuffs on one side, or you're a completely defeated and dejected person on the other side who is then sitting and placed within these camps that are made to kill you, right? Either way, we can't have these kind of structures that exist without ultimately dominating the mind.
Mm. And as you were speaking there, you and I exactly, we grew up in similar circumstances, so we've had to navigate sort of these systems. And I want to touch on something you said there is navigating these dynamics that quite literally kill us. And I think one of my goals with this platform and with Colorful is to be able to actually equip people with the vocabulary to sort of like free themselves and to heal. When I asked you to join this conversation, I started it off and I think I said, friend, I completely understand if you don't want to touch anything as divisive as this. And I think I tried to make a case that, hey, listen, like, we would sanitize the issue or whatever. And your response floored me. And I think I'm just so used to asking people of color probably to speak on their experiences and to call out racism. And the response I always get is, it can have real life implications on my career and personal life and all of these things. And it's very legitimate and it's very valid. But your response was just like, let's go. You were like, let's go. And I look at all the things and I look at your journey of activism. I think I was telling Stacy offline, is I remember seeing you as a child on TV speaking about these very structures during the Fees Was Full movement. And I remember seeing you in so many things. I've seen you on TV speaking about the Marikana massacre, and your activism has you've always had so much conviction in this. Have you ever worried of how standing up and speaking and trying to bring this level of healing will affect you in your personal life, in your career, and what sort of things have helped you let go of that sort of fear?
I worry about it every day, right? Like activism is my personal life. I think you need to be a bit more specific about what I did say to you when you asked me. So she sent me a VM and she called and asked me. And my response was, Nibasaba Nabilum. What is it that instills a big amount of fear in your heart about whiteness? Because ultimately it demonstrates that we're not free. If we cannot have this conversation without contemplating the idea that we're forfeiting so much, then we're really unfree. And do I even want to keep quiet in a world like that? I think, Senamile, you will know there is no reward for behaving well. Like racism is going to moor you nonetheless. Like you can keep quiet, you can have the best English accent in the world, you can go to work, you can pledge all kinds of allegiances. But the unfortunate part is that racism does not discriminate. It will process you regardless, right? But that's not why, like, I have this kind of orchestration, right? My life is not necessarily this big antithesis to oppression and so. All of my work is an act of love. Like every single thing, I contemplate it is like, how can I love people better, you know? And I don't view the work as activism. I'm having such an interesting relationship. I'm trying to remove this attachment of people, referring to me as an activist. I'm just a community member. I'm a member of the community. And the social responsibility that comes with philosophies such as Ubuntu requires us to tell the truth. To me, I feel perfectly fine. I don't feel like I'm sacrificing anything. Every single time I've shown courage and love towards Black people, I've gained, right? Every single time I've showed a sense of structural, pushback and tried to challenge white people on their ideas, I've gained. The only thing I have lost maybe is some sense of financial mobility. But I mean, thank the cosmos and thank God that some person in a big global law firm looked at what I had to say and think and thought, oh, okay, cool. So a big part of my courage is also because I'm incredibly insulated, right? I speak of these things not having to worry about how the workplace is going to look at me on Monday, because at some point, somebody a couple of years ago had this crazy idea that I had and was able to create a law firm where degenerates and misfits like me can practice the law, right? So essentially, the world is bending towards the correct, direction because people like all three of us exist and are not necessarily only making the noise, but are living the noise. I don't know any other way of being. I'm my grandfather's child, A big part of how my family, my dad got to South Africa is because I come from a family of people who wouldn't shut up about what was wrong, right? So I think we have to have a level of honor and commitment to our stories, right? If really, really we're living out our names, we have to really, really place ourselves in the place. We can't speak on Biko if we're not doing the work that Biko was doing. We can't speak on the work that, Mama Winnie Madikizela was doing if we are not doing that work. It's disingenuous and we should be called out.
I'm so grateful that you said all three of us in this room, because it's a different journey and one that has been a whole lot easier, obviously, as a white person. But it's been a different journey speaking about racism from the body of a white person. And I mean, I've spoken about this on the podcast before, to say that I was complacent for way too long. I looked away for way too long, and I'm desperately ashamed of it. And a large part of that was because I was too terrified to enter the conversation. I didn't, and never will, have a full, I mean, I can obviously never have any kind of understanding. I didn't have the vocabulary, and I'm only starting to build the type of vocabulary that I need now to be sensitive without even trying to assume that I have any idea of the experiences and the trauma that have been felt by most of our country because of people who look like me, including me. And so that privilege has meant that I've never had to engage with this concept of race. And so I didn't until now. And so I want to ask you, as someone who has experience with this love for all people, and as someone who included me in the idea of us three in this room, which was really quite something for me, what do you think the role of white people are in this conversation? What is our role in dismantling systemic racism? And I'm talking about people exactly like me, people who are not in any way famous. They're not outright activists. They're not writing laws. They are the people who go about living their lives every single day in the workplace, in their homes, in their social circles. What is it that they can do to dismantle systemic racism? Because I happen to know that a lot of them feel guilty, but what kind of, it's pointless feeling guilty. So what do we do with that?
And I was quite intentional to say all of us. You are in this too. Earlier on, I referred to the idea that white people are robbed of their human experience when they are finding themselves, exerting this kind of real harm on society, of a real taking without giving back. I think there are 2 points I'm going to make. One, it's not the business of Black people to tell white people what to do about racism. White people are very well versed in racism because they are the originators of it, right? I mean, a lot of the time, people will tell me that, no, white people don't know how to engage racism. I say, Until very recently, white people were conscripted for almost 2 years at a time into a military that was geared towards exterminating black people. They have a very good knowledge of what it is that they are engaging in, and they are just pleading ignorance, right? And there's that aspect of it. And then further, we make this argument that, but there are white people within white space who have acknowledged power, privilege, positionality, and have undertaken the work, right? But usually, what those kind of people do, this is where I then categorize you, Stacy, is they form networks of solidarity that kind of improve the odds for black people, but they don't necessarily directly engage white power. And I think that is the role of well meaning white people in the space. It's for them to contest and take the social death amongst white circles because I can't enter the bride. I can't make the moral argument. I've always said this. There was a person who came and told me, "Oh, my father is so racist, what." And I said, "Tell your father yourself that the cost of racism is losing a daughter." And then we see. You see, so that is the role of well-meaning white people in the unfolding democracy that all of us have agreed to, is to be able to make the case for the survival of like humanity within whiteness, is to engage them. Black people are organized. Black people have been organized, and they don't need, any more people to organize. But what we don't have access to is white life, right? We are not at the material levels, because remember, by the time any kind of black person has made it into the spaces that white people have created for themselves, we have to do it in English, subservience, and the ability to be expelled. We don't have a lifetime membership to those spaces. And there is a seriousness, right? I mean, I could have lied to you and made you feel good and said, no, it's acceptable. We don't appreciate anything, man. We're on fire, And so what is important is for us to point at it and say, well, listen, there's that space we're unable to access, right? And then remember, history has been changed by only ordinary people, people like you and me, right? And it's important for us to have that discussion. I think where we can then have a mutual joint conversation is in tactics. Tactically, what do we do? How do we organize? What do we read? What do we disseminate? Which communities do we lend our privilege to? I still need to have a very big conversation with Sena about, the idea of the billable hour. Something I'm really, really considering is, if I am causing or generating a certain amount of million rands in billable fees or chargeable fees a year, I must be able to generate the same amount of money to social good. Because, we find ourselves in a situation where even in the work we're doing, we're entrenching, we're perpetuating, and we're finding ourselves becoming more and more out of touch. And so it's important for us to have that conversation amongst ourselves as well. But Stacey, to conclude the point, I think, I think white people need to stop trying to be white, and they just need to try and be human beings, and that requires such a robust engagement with who we are, who we can be, right? And I suffer the same kind of existential crisis with patriarchy and masculinity, right? With ableism as well. I sit and I'm just like, man, have you heard men talk about women when men are on their own? It's scary, bro. But like, I'm not going to send Sena or you into that kind of situation. I have to stop the discussions. I have to find how to structurally engage men, right? And outside of a position of shame, I don't think shame is useful in anything, right? So love has to take over in a very coordinated way, in almost a militant way, but in a way where we are all willing to lose our life, colleagues. We're all willing to lose the bit of progress that we've had in order to facilitate a better world, a more human world, because I suspect that the madness that all of us have in us is going to get us there. You are the kind of person that we need, Stacey, to be at the forefront of these kind of discussions, but not only discussions, mechanisms of changing life and orchestration. Like, I wish I could unknow what I know and unfeel what I feel and just be blind to it so that I can enjoy a croissant at Four Nose. I can be at La Parade. I genuinely wish, but we can't anymore because, God has given us this lot of wanting to deliver a better world, and we'll have to take it for what it is, all of us. It's not going to be easy.
Friend, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming onto this platform. Thank you for lending your wisdom. And most importantly, thank you for spreading your message of love.
Yeah, and thank you so much for lending me space, man. I was really nervous at first because I was like, we can't dishonor the work you guys are doing. And do the work because the work means something, right? And sometimes people are going to speak on the imperfection of what's happening. You know, people are going to say, yeah, we're tired of racial dialogue, of gender based dialogue. But, you know, people who don't record what's happening don't tell the time efficiently. History is going to thank you for populating the pages, right? History can't have blank pages because people like you are doing this work. So, um, I'm really, really honored that you thought of me as a guest, and I didn't take it lightly. And I wish you everything of the best and all the success in the world. And I hope one day, you know, we will sit and have a different kind of conversation of what we do when we're free, you know. But it was such a privilege to be a guest, and all power to both of you, man. It was really cool.
Thank you so much, friend. And that brings us to the end of our episode. We really hope that all our listeners enjoyed this, and we encourage you to subscribe to Colorful Podcast on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, with episodes out every 2 weeks. Please rate us, comment, and share with your community so that we can keep this very important conversation going. Until next time.